everybody. I'm Larry Kudlow from CNBC and National Review Online, and I'm here with former Governor Tim Pawlenty, who is the president and CEO of the Financial Services Roundtable. This is the Kudlow-Pawlenty podcast. Maybe it's the Pawlenty-Kudlow podcast. Tim Pawlenty, how are you?
I'm great, Larry, and I am worried about this deteriorating situation in Iraq, and I know that's going to have a big effect not just in public policy circles, but also financial circles, so I know we want to get into that, but I'm glad to be back with you on the podcast.
Thank you, sir. Let's talk about that. It's a very important, and you're right, it has all manner of implications. I don't know if you saw General Keene's op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this morning. Keene, of course, is one of the principal backers of the now famous surge back in 2007 and 2008. And, Tim, he talks about putting some troops on the ground, not necessarily fighting troops, but he talks about special forces. We're going to need help for planning to help the Baghdad government clear away the radicals. We're also going to need some counterterrorism help, and we're going to need some people on the ground for air power. Now, the president, as you know, has already said he's going to put in 250 or so troops to guard our embassy. What's your gut instinct on this? Is this the beginning of a return to Iraq by the USA, or can we actually manage this situation?
Well, first thing, when I was governor, I had a chance to visit Iraq 5 times, including the embassy in its current advanced form. And it's a very large embassy. And obviously, we need to make sure it's protected. There's a lot of key personnel there and a lot of personnel. Some of them are being evacuated, but we can't continue to have an embassy that's not properly guarded. So I'm glad he's putting in the additional help with respect to the embassy. But then beyond that, obviously, Iraq is part of a larger picture. But just focusing on Iraq for a moment, obviously, one of the main tension points here is a religious tension, or really bordering on a civil war. So air strikes aren't going to resolve that, but what could help is getting Nouri al-Maliki, their current leader, to stop being a Shia-only leader and have an inclusive government. Whether he can actually do that when he hasn't done it in the preceding 8 years remains to be seen, but that should be a conditioned precedent. And then you got to create some space and some time to see if that can actually unfold. So that means maintaining, or at least returning to some level of security, and that's why the steps that you've just outlined, I think Jack Keene has outlined, should be considered and implemented.
One of the problems I have with this whole story is Maliki. I think the guy is duplicitous, power-hungry. I think he lies through his teeth. And Tim Pawlenty, I don't believe anything he says regarding rapprochement with either the Kurds or the Sunnis, the non-radical Sunnis, the Anbar Sunnis that you recall helped the surge to succeed. I don't think Maliki will ever do that, and therefore I wondered out loud, why should we help this guy at all? Maybe we should just leave this whole situation to its own devices and see what happens, whether that means the separation of Iraq into different provinces or camp or whatever. He is not the guy.
Well, 8 years of history with him would suggest that you're right on that point, Larry, that he's not able to, because he's unwilling or incapable of building the right kinds of bridges to have a true coalition government that would include Sunnis, of course, Maliki's a Shia, and other minority groups. He's utterly failed in that effort, and I don't know if he's unwilling or unable, but he's failed in that effort. So if the United States did make another effort here, it would have to be based on a conclusion and a condition that he would be able to do that. But history would show he's failed so far.
Now, the other point I want to talk about is this business about USA talking to Iran. Of course, no one trusts Iran on any subject at any time. First of all, will Iran keep backing Maliki? I mean, isn't it their interest? He's their guy. He's the Shia.
Yeah, for our listeners here on this podcast, which is, I think, dubbed Money in Politics, people should remember, in the Middle East, one of the main organizing principles is this Shia-Sunni split. And Iran is a Persian country. It's not predominantly an Arab country. It's also predominantly a Shia country. Iraq had been for so many years governed by Saddam Hussein, who was Ba'athist Party person, but predominantly run a Sunni government. And he oppressed the Shias, even though they were a majority in Iraq. So now you have Iran next door to Iraq, who's a Shia country, being willing to help the current Iraq government, Maliki's government, because they're a Shia government. And, those two being aligned should be concerning to the United States and the region, much of which that remains in the region is Sunni. And Tom Friedman said something recently I think we should all keep in mind, Larry, that the enemy of our enemy is still our enemy. And in the case of Iran, I think inviting them in, looking the other way, or empowering them to enter Iraq governmentally or militarily or otherwise is a really bad idea.
I mean, I agree, and I think, I really think we have two viable options here. All right, one of them does not include Iran, as you just said. Either we get Maliki to step down, and if he does, then we could employ possibly the General Keane idea, limited forces and bombing and so forth, better counterintelligence. Or if he won't step down, which is likely, then do nothing. Just have restraint. Let it be.
Well, in the do-nothing scenario, and I know people are frustrated. So much blood and treasure and sacrifice has been given for this country, Iraq. And it's sad to see it unravel like this. It's tragic. So what are the Americans' remaining interests? What's our remaining interest there? One is to make sure we don't have a reformulation of a terrorist group that presents a direct threat to the United States or our clear strategic interests abroad. ISIS arguably presents such a threat. And then number two, there's regional implications here too. As you know, you could have a realignment between Syria and Iraq and Iran that could become a major boiling pot for other trouble. But think about how the rest of the region might react to that if that Syria, Iraq, Iran alliance, which would predominantly be a Shia alliance if it succeeded, how the rest of the region would react to that. When the rest of the region is Sunni, you might have a broader regional war, which could really cascade into a series of very, very catastrophic events.
Well, all right, we'll never solve this morning. I just think a lot of Americans, including myself, who are, we are so loyal to our fighting men and women. They've done what they can. They actually won this thing, and now we may be giving it back because of a rather incoherent Obama administration policy. Do we want to go back in again? I mean, I think that's going to have to be an issue that's resolved. Governor Pawlenty, let me go back. You're the CEO of the Financial Services Roundtable. The Federal Reserve is meeting this week. They're going to end their bond buying program on time. Is that how it's going to work?
Well, I suppose it's a question of what on time now means with this, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it as well. And by the way, I'd love to get your thoughts on how the market's going to react to this situation in Iraq. But on the bond buying program, I see no indication that they are going to change from their directional plan of slightly reducing it each month and then winding it down over the near and intermediate time. So I predict that they'll continue to stay the course and that they won't make any noteworthy changes this week.
I think you're right. They are going to stay the course. They're going to take another cut in bond purchases this week to $35 billion. That's $10 billion less. They'll move it down to $25 billion in July. They'll move it to $15 billion in September, and the final $15 billion taper will be announced at the October meeting. We'll be done with that. Now the question is, with inflation creeping up, today's inflation numbers, CPI 0.4%, last month 0.3%. They're above the target. The year-on-year inflation rate is 2.1%. Now, I'm not convinced that we really face a big inflation problem, but the Fed's target is 2%, so they're above the target. Does that mean anything? Do your members think it means anything? Do your members think the Fed might raise interest rates sooner or later? That's a $64,000 question.
Well, I don't think, and I think my members don't think, that the Fed wants to do anything significantly different than the forward guidance that they've issued, because if they did, that could have disruptive effects, and they're trying to, as you know, have a elegantly timed exit, which may be very impossible or at least difficult to do. But, there are many of my members, they're not all of one mind here, are concerned about, or at least see on the horizon some uptick in inflation. And, that has consequences for banks and for the economy, and for consumers, for the country more broadly. But I don't see the Federal Reserve, absent some significant new development, changing their guidance on winding down the bond purchase program and their call to slightly raise interest rates, but not until the intermediate term.
Right until the end of next year. The Fed will overshoot its inflation target. Yellen has said that. Bernanke has said that. They will overshoot in order to keep as much stimulus in the economy as possible. I think that's going to be the course of action. And I would just comment editorials there. I started my career at the Federal Reserve many years ago. I can't really remember the Fed doing anything elegantly. I just
well, you're going to try to do it elegantly, and it never works. It's impossible. It's probably impossible. But Larry, what do you make of the fact that the tapering continues on course? They've indicated a willingness or likelihood of increasing interest rates in the intermediate term next summer, and the markets have not only responded negatively, they've responded at least recently, quite positively. So how do you interpret all of that, and what do you think that means?
I think that the markets are saying that there is no danger of what I would call tight money, even if they raise their target rate, whether it's the Fed funds rate or it's a newer rate called reverse RPs. We can go into that another time. I don't think you're going to get the Fed raising significantly interest rates. I don't think you'll have tight money. I don't think you're going to have an inverted yield curve where short rates are higher than long rates, which generally spells tight money in recession, for at least 2 years, maybe longer. And therefore, I think the risk of recession is nil. And I think that's actually fairly optimistic for the stock market, at least in the short run. So don't expect hard money from the Fed. By the way, everybody should read Steve Forbes' new book about relinking the dollar to gold. I just want to put that advertisement in, mainly because I happen to agree with him. Let us move on. House leadership, Governor Pawlenty. Okay, House leadership. Kevin McCarthy is the odds-on favorite to become majority whip. I want to ask you if you agree with that, and I want to ask you whether, majority leader rather, and I want to ask you who's going to become the chief whip and the deputy whip, and will conservatives be represented in the new leadership lineup?
Well, I think Kevin McCarthy has effectively won the majority leader position, becoming Eric Cantor's replacement. For those who don't know, Kevin McCarthy, he's a jovial, likable Californian, and is viewed as somebody who's put a lot of elbow grease into other people's campaigns and helped them along the way. So it's just a tremendous reservoir of goodwill amongst his fellow members of Congress. I think that explains in big part why he's about to be the majority leader. And then in terms of the whip and deputy whip positions, there's a robust campaign underway, and the conservatives, the more hardcore or more committed conservatives, desperately want or very much want one of their own in that position. So you're looking at some people like Scalzi, Roscom, and others who are making a bid for that position. It's hard to tell who's going to win, but many think that Scalzi has the inside track on that position.
All right. Now, Eric Cantor, defeated, was a great friend of Wall Street, got an awful lot of his money from Wall Street. In your judgment, is the Financial Roundtable bemoaning Eric Cantor's laws? Are they ready for an assault against corporate welfare? And that assault might begin voting against the reauthorization of the XM Bank, which goes to gigantic corporations like GE and Boeing and Dow Chemical. Is your membership ready for this anti-corporate welfare assault?
Well, I think Eric Cantor served the country well on a whole variety of issues, and he did have a financial background, so he understood these issues, which often can be complex, in some cases demagogue. But there are a few issues that the Congress has before it that could be impacted by his departure. One is that XM Import Bank that you just mentioned, although it was facing a challenging path even before the Cantor development. But again, for our listeners, this is a program that does help some big companies, but it helps and small companies too, by the way, importantly. But it helps level the playing field when you have people in other countries subsidizing, from a state standpoint, and the United States is on an unlevel playing field. So I think it faces a very uphill battle now. There's another issue called TRIA, Terrorism Risk Insurance Renewal, which we think will get renewed in modified form. But I don't think there's going to be a fundamental shift in the Congress just because of Eric Cantor's departure on these issues. The sentiments around these issues were pretty much pre-baked before his departure.
So it's downhill. I mean, according to one study, 97% of the XM loan guarantees went to the largest companies, and 97% of the bank's direct loans went to the largest companies. And as I said, giants like Boeing, GE, and Dow Chemical received roughly 3/4 of the bank's financial assistance for export. I don't understand why the U.S. government has to subsidize these big shareholder-owned companies. I'm all for the companies. I'm a free market guy. I would abolish the corporate tax, by the way, and I would allow them to repatriate their cash overseas to avoid the double tax. But why should we subsidize them?
Well, the main reason is simply this. There are foreign companies who buy goods from American companies who arguably otherwise would not, but for the presence of the Export-Import Bank and the support that they provide. So that's the argument for it. And then people say, well, why do we do that? We do that in part because other countries don't play fair and they subsidize their American competitors. So we can either choose to lose the business and lose the jobs and the economic activity, or have something like the Export-Import Bank to try to help level the playing field at least at a modest level. So those are the arguments.
All those companies are doing well. Their stock prices are soaring. Why do we want to be like France? Why do we want to be like France?
Yeah, understood. But let's say you're Boeing, and we can make the principled argument that we don't need to subsidize Boeing, but then Boeing loses a whole bunch of big contracts to Airbus, and then all of a sudden Boeing has to lay off a bunch of people and all the cascading effects that it has on suppliers and the like. So, from a philosophical and principled standpoint, you make a very good argument. But the question is, do we then just unilaterally disarm relative to some of these other places that are subsidizing our competitors?
I think free market competition and free market capitalism, Governor Pawlenty, is the best path to prosperity.
I know you do, and that you make a powerful point.
Okay. Governor Tim Pawlenty, head of the Financial Services Roundtable. Thank you, sir. I'm Larry Kudlow. This is the Pawlenty-Kudlow podcast. We'll be here every Tuesday. Thank you, sir.
All right. Thanks, Larry.